Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to really dive deep into President Trump's tariffs.
hmm
He's calling it an economic revolution. And I guess he's not wrong, right? We are talking about a whole new baseline tax, 10%, basically on everything coming in from other countries.
Yeah, and it even gets higher than that 10% for countries where, we buy a lot more from them than they buy from us.
Exactly. And on top of that, there are discussions about extending these tariffs to some really key industries, things like, pharmaceuticals, even those crucial semiconductor chips.
Right, this is a big deal. We are really seeing a fundamental change in how the U.S. interacts with the global economy. And like you said, it's broad, it's wide-ranging. I mean, it really is redrawing the lines of trade for the U.S.
No doubt about it. And we know that with all these headlines and developments, you're probably looking for some clear answers.
Mm.
So in this deep dive, we're going to try to unpack it all, look beyond the headlines, and really figure out what these tariffs actually mean for us. What's happening right now, what could happen down the line. We've pulled together all the news reports, official statements, everything we could get our hands on to paint a full picture.
We really want to give you a multifaceted view, the whole story, as it were.
Exactly. Now, where do we even begin with something this big? Well, I think a good place to start is with the markets, because as we all know, the markets tend to react pretty quickly and sometimes pretty dramatically. And in this case, it was not a calm response.
No, it was a full-blown sell-off, a massive one. We saw, get this, over $6.5 trillion, that's
Sure.
trillion with a T, wiped out from U.S. stocks in just 48 hours, 2 days.
Oh, 6.5 trillion. I mean, that's such a huge number. It's hard to wrap your head around it.
Right.
But what does it really tell us about, how investors are feeling about all this?
Well, it shows they're worried, right? $6.5 trillion disappearing like that. That's a huge signal. Investors are clearly concerned about potential problems down the road. Supply chains getting messed up, American businesses suddenly facing much higher costs.
Especially those businesses that rely heavily on imported materials.
Yeah, for sure, especially those. And also, any industry that's already operating on thin margins, where every penny counts, those are going to be hit hard. And of course, the companies that rely on, steady global demand, if demand drops because of these tariffs, they're in trouble.
It's interesting because I remember seeing some analysts comparing this market reaction to what happened when COVID first hit.
It's a valid comparison, yeah. Both events triggered this incredible, almost panic selling.
Right.
I think it speaks to the level of uncertainty surrounding the tariffs. Like, will this be a short-term dip or a longer-term problem?
Right. Like, is this going to be as disruptive as COVID? No one really knows.
That's exactly it. No one knows for sure. And to add to that, we had Jerome Powell, the Federal Reserve Chair, expressing concerns too. He's worried about these tariffs driving up inflation and, potentially slowing down the entire economy.
And that's a pretty big deal, right? When you have the head of the Federal Reserve himself raising a red flag, people pay attention.
That's not something you can ignore. The Fed chair doesn't speak lightly. And what he's saying, essentially, is that these tariffs could end up hurting everyday Americans. Prices could go up, and the economy could stall.
It's kind of a domino effect, right? Businesses have to pay more, so that they raise prices for consumers.
Exactly. And then consumers have less money to spend, so demand goes down and the whole economy slows down. And that's not even the worst case scenario.
Okay, hold on. There's a worst case scenario.
Well, JP Morgan put out a warning that these tariffs could actually, contribute to pushing the US and even the global economy into a recession. That's a scary thought.
So, not exactly sunny predictions from the experts in the markets. But, of course, President Trump has a different take.
Yeah, he's framing it as a positive thing, an economic revolution.
Right, and it's interesting, isn't it? He sees it as this, bold move that will ultimately benefit America, bring back jobs, strengthen our industries.
Yeah, he even posted on Truth Social saying that there's already been more than $5 trillion of investment and rising fast because of the tariffs.
5 trillion. Wow.
It's a bold claim, for sure. Of course, he acknowledges it won't be easy. He's even said that it will take time, maybe a year and a half, 2 years, for American manufacturing to become more self-reliant.
So he's asking Americans to be patient, hang tough, as he puts it.
Exactly. He's saying that, in the long run, this end result will be historic. Those were his words.
And what about the stock market? The huge drop. Did he address that?
He did. He said it was expected and that it's only temporary. He's confident the markets will bounce back stronger than ever.
He sees this as a temporary dip, a bump in the road on the way to a stronger economy. And he's also using these tariffs as leverage, a bargaining chip in negotiations with other countries.
He basically said they'll do anything for us once they feel the pressure.
It's an interesting strategy, using these tariffs as a way to force other countries to make concessions.
Right, like he's saying, look, if you want to trade with us, you need to play by our rules.
And I remember him using that analogy of the U.S. economy being a sick patient
Hmm.
and these tariffs being the necessary, albeit painful, operation.
It's a pretty strong image, right? He's trying to say that the U.S. economy needs this tough medicine, even if it hurts in the short term.
So that's President Trump's view, very much focused on this long-term vision of a stronger, more independent America. But what about the people actually working within his administration? Are they all completely on board with this, or are there some, differing opinions, different nuances?
Well, officials in the White House are really pushing back against the idea that this will cause huge price increases for consumers. They're arguing that actually it'll be the other countries, the exporters, who end up paying the cost of the tariffs.
So they're saying that, these countries will have to lower their prices to stay competitive, and American consumers won't see much of a difference to the checkout.
Right. They're pointing to the fact that over 50 countries have reached out to the U.S. to negotiate. And they're saying that, this shows that those countries are feeling the heat.
It's like, hey, if you want access to the American market, you better work with us.
Right. And Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick has been pretty optimistic, too. He's emphasizing that these tariffs are really about making sure our trading partners respect us and address our concerns about unfair trade practices.
It's about leveling the playing field.
Exactly. And Peter Navarro, he's even predicted that the market will find a bottom soon, meaning he thinks this whole stock market dip is just temporary.
Okay, so some optimism coming from the administration, but weren't there some conflicting messages, especially when it came to the possibility of negotiations?
Right. There was a bit of a mixed message there. On the one hand, you had the press secretary saying very clearly that this is not about negotiation. They called it a response to a national emergency.
So it's a firm stance, not a bargaining tactic.
Yeah, but then the Secretary of Agriculture suggested that there is still room for dialogue, for
It's a
discussions.
little confusing, right?
A little bit. But I think, when you're implementing a big, complicated policy like this, there are bound to be some mixed messages in the beginning.
And then there's the conversation President Trump had with Vietnam's leader. Apparently, he turned down their offer of zero tariffs because he wants to negotiate on other things.
Like intellectual property protection, regulations, things like that.
So it's really about using these tariffs as a broader tool to change the terms of trade, not just about the immediate tax.
It's a multi-pronged approach.
Okay, so we've talked about the market reaction, the official rationale, the politics, but let's get down to brass tacks. What are the potential economic impacts beyond Wall Street? How could this affect everyday Americans like, you and me, our wallets?
The biggest impact for consumers is likely going to be higher prices. We're talking about a wide range of goods: electronics, cars, clothing, even some food items.
The stuff we buy every day, that's a big concern.
It is. And the timing of these price increases is going to vary a lot. Some companies might have, stocked up in advance, so it might take a while for the prices to go up.
So we might not see the effects right away.
Right. But for some products, especially things that are perishable or have short supply chains, the price increases could happen pretty quickly.
I remember the March jobs report came out around the same time these tariffs were announced, and it actually showed really strong job growth, which is surprising to some.
Yeah, a lot of people didn't expect that.
Is there a connection there?
It's tough to say for sure, but some experts are saying that maybe those job gains, especially in areas like healthcare, transportation, and warehousing, could be related to businesses getting ready for these changes.
Like preparing for supply chain disruptions or, a potential increase in domestic production.
Exactly. It'll be interesting to see how the job market develops in the coming months.
And then there was the unemployment rate, which ticked up slightly to 4.2%.
Right, and we also saw a decrease in federal government jobs.
Budget cuts.
Yeah, budget cuts. And they say the full impact of those layoffs might take a while to show up in the data.
So the job market is kind of a mixed bag right now. Some positive signs, some potential concerns.
It is. The picture isn't clear yet, and of course, all of this is happening in the middle of this big political debate in Washington.
Right, because these tariffs are a pretty massive policy shift. It's no surprise that it's generating a lot of discussion and, disagreement in Congress.
You've got Democrats who are mostly critical of the tariffs, and then even among Republicans, there's a range of reactions.
Not a unified front.
Right. Some Republicans are fully on board with the president, but there's a smaller group who are actually opposed to the tariffs.
And they're even working with Democrats to try and, limit the president's emergency powers.
Yeah, that's pretty significant. And then there's this, like, middle ground of Republicans who seem to be a bit hesitant, maybe uncomfortable with the tariffs, but still willing to give the president the benefit of the doubt.
It's interesting, right? It seems like they agree with the general goals of the tariffs, protecting American jobs, standing up to unfair trade practices, but they're not sure about the methods, the approach.
And I remember Senator Ron Johnson, who's a Republican and usually supports the president. He said he really hopes the president is right about this, but he's also wondering, what's the plan if the tariffs don't actually work?
It's a good question. Like, what's the next step if this doesn't achieve what it's supposed to?
And it's interesting because, constitutionally, Congress is actually the one that's supposed to have the main authority over trade and tariffs. But over time, a lot of that power has shifted to the president, the executive branch.
And now some members of Congress are trying to kind of reclaim some of that authority.
Right. There's this bipartisan proposal from Senator Grassley, a Republican, and Senator Cantwell, a Democrat, saying that Congress should have a say in these tariffs.
So they want Congress to be able to, review and vote on tariffs proposed by the president.
Exactly. It's an attempt to reassert some congressional control over trade policy.
But not everyone's on board with that idea.
No, even Senator Johnson, who had those reservations about the tariffs, he's actually against this proposal. He said his constituents strongly support the president's policies, so he's not going to challenge him on this.
So it's really complex, this whole interplay between Congress and the president. And then there's another figure who's not a lawmaker, but has a lot of power in this whole process. That's Elizabeth McDonough, the Senate parliamentarian.
She's a powerful but often overlooked figure. Most people probably don't even know who she is or what she does.
Right, so what exactly is her role?
So basically, she's the referee for the Senate. She decides what can and cannot be included in budget reconciliation bills.
And these reconciliation bills are important because they can bypass the usual 60-vote requirement in the Senate.
Right. They only need a simple majority to pass. And her rulings, whether something is actually budget related or not, can determine what becomes law.
Our sources even compared it to, like, working the refs in a sports game.
Yeah.
You try to make your case, but ultimately, she makes the call.
And it's pretty interesting because she's not an elected official, but she has a lot of influence over legislation.
So this economic revolution, as President Trump calls it, is multifaceted, to say the least. It's triggered this huge reaction in the markets. There are worries about price increases. The job market is a bit uncertain, and Congress is divided.
And on top of all that, the president and his administration are very optimistic. They're pushing back against the critics and saying that, this is a necessary, albeit painful, step towards a stronger America.
It's a lot to take in. The immediate impacts are already happening. We're seeing that in the stock market, and we could see it at the checkout soon. But the long-term effects, how all of this will reshape global trade, that's still a big unknown.
It really is. And it's a story that's going to keep developing.
So as you can see, this is anything but straightforward. There are a lot of moving parts, a lot of different perspectives. What do you think will happen in the next year or two? Will this economic revolution ultimately succeed, or will the costs outweigh the benefits? We encourage you to keep following this story and form your own conclusions. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.